Welcome back to the 10x Contract Value Podcast, the show where contracts aren't paperwork, they're profit. I'm your host, Tyja Dickerson, and today we're diving into one of the biggest questions facing executive leaders right now. How do you manage risk in a world where disruption is the norm, not the exception? Today's guest is someone who's helped global organizations shift from reacting to risk to leading through it. Omer Abdullah. Omer is the co-founder of the Smart Cube, where he spent nearly 20 years building a global leader in procurement and market intelligence that's trusted by Fortune 500 companies to make smarter, faster decisions in uncertain times. Omer is also the author of Risk and Your Supply Chain, Preparing for the Next Global Crisis, a must-read for leaders facing continued disruption across supply networks. He recently exited the Smart Cube after scaling it into a globally recognized intelligence powerhouse, and he's now entering an exciting new chapter. Today, Omer joins us to unpack why risk isn't something to manage, it's something to leverage. So let's get into it. Hi, Omer. How are you today? Thank you for joining us.
I'm great, Ty. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm happy to be on the show.
Awesome. So did I miss anything in your intro? You have an amazing background, but I definitely don't want to shortcut your experiences and what you've brought to the industry.
No, I think you got it right. I started my career in management consulting. I was there for almost 10 years, and then I left at this point a little over 2 decades ago to start the Smart Cube with a couple of other guys. And that's kind of what I've been focused on over the last 2 decades. And as you said, I stepped away last year after kind of a lot of soul searching and thinking about what we had built. And excited to be here and talking about kind of where we are and where we go from here.
Yes. Well, I have to tell you, I'm always pleased to be in your presence as also a founder of a company that's trying to drive impact in the industry, to see the other side of it where you get to exit and start your next chapter. I definitely always appreciate sharing that space with you. So looking back, what problems were you originally trying to solve when you launched the Smart Cube, and how did that essentially evolve over time?
Sure. So we started the firm in the early 2000s, and so there's a couple of things that were driving it, right? So one is a very client-driven problem that we thought we could solve. So as I said, I worked in management consulting, and a lot of clients who would come to me and say, hey, we love the work that you're doing, but if I look at what you do, it really breaks up into 2 things: research and analytics work and advice, right? And what a lot of organizations were saying was, I love the advisory work, but what I really need is the research and analytics work on a day-to-day basis to support what I do, to enable my work on a day-to-day basis. And I'd love to be able to get that so that I can leverage it on a day-to-day basis and do it without having to pay consulting rates, if you will. Now, at that time, India was very well known for business process outsourcing, sort of tactical, transactional work that needed to get done. It was a good place to get that work done. And our perspective was, we think we can leverage these global markets to build analyst teams that can do high value work, intelligence, analytics, insight, knowledge work, if you will. And that was the bet that we placed in those days, that we could probably build something that would be pretty interesting. So think of it as in a way, it's decoupling the consulting value chain by breaking apart the research and analytics from the advisory work. That's what we set out to try and do. And so that was the genesis of the business. That's why I left consulting after a decade. I think I was 6 months from making partner and decided, this was the right thing to go do. And that's what we focused on building. So that was the genesis of the idea and kind of where this all came from.
And then how did it evolve over time? Like by the time that you left the Smart Cube or exited?
Yeah, so we started out as a pure services business. We had analyst base in different countries: India, Romania, Uruguay. And so a couple of specific things I'll point out that happened over the course of that. There's many things that happened, but I'll point out a couple of the key ones. The first one happened right about a year or two after we started the firm. Is, when we started out, when you bootstrap a business, which is what we did, the bottom line is you want revenue. So you'll do whatever work you need to do to get it done. But within a year or two, we realized that there was a real need and a demand for work in procurement and supply chain. That those practitioners, those executives had a real need for intelligence and insight to make better decisions more quickly, more fact-based, data-driven, to drive their work. So we quickly began to specialize in that particular space and became one of the best-known brands in that area. That was kind of the first big aspect that I think I'd point out in the journey of the Smart Cube. The second aspect I'd point out is kind of the evolution of the organization from a pure services analyst-driven business to becoming a hybrid technology and services-oriented business, where we, by the time I left the Smart Cube, we had 3 core solutions. For each of those solutions, we had a technology platform, and then we had custom services over and above that. And that was a pretty important shift in what we did, how we did it. It was in response to client needs and requirements, but it was also an innovative push because we recognize the value of technology that's there. But we also recognize the value of high value people to couple with that technology and really drive impact and value. So I'd say those are the 2 prime shifts over the evolution, that emphasis on procurement, and then the transition from being a pure services organization to a hybrid technology platform and services organization. I'd say those are the 2 things that are most prominent that stand out.
Yes. No, I would say that there are a lot of solutions out there. Not many of them couple that specialized expertise with the technology. Many times there's this hype and a need to solve a problem, and then you find some advisors and then you build a solution. But having that in-house expertise, I think, definitely allows that solution to be built for need, fit for purpose, and then, evolve and customize over time. So I'm a big fan of the Smart Cube. And so what would you say is your proudest moment or your time in building and leading the Smart Cube?
Sure. It feels like a cliche to say, there's so many, and there really are so many. I mean, the cliche is accurate. That's why it's a cliche. But I would say that to me, there's sort of 3 really, really important things that I sort of take away from that experience that I'm most proud of, right? Number 1 is just the caliber of the team that we built. I mean, the people that I got to work with on a day-to-day basis across the world as part of our organization was fantastic. One of the things, if you're working in management consulting, that almost every management consulting who leaves a consulting firm we tell each other is, oh my God, the caliber of individuals that I had in that organization was fantastic, right? And I don't know if I'll ever get that again. And I was lucky, fortunate. I think it's a combination of effort as well as luck that allowed us to build a fantastic caliber team. So I would say first and foremost, it's just the amazing people that I got to work with and just these relationships that I built. So that was number 1, first and foremost. The second aspect was, by virtue of the area that I focused on, which was around procurement, we were able to work with some fantastic clients, not only global names that everybody's heard of, but, small and medium businesses that were sort of coming into their own and needed insight in analytics and intelligence that before us, they would not have been able to get in the same way. And so just the sheer impact that we had with a lot of these organizations and clients was fantastic. And I'd say the third thing at a personal level was the fact that we built the organization from scratch, right? We bootstrapped this business. We didn't raise external funding, which was an intentional decision at the outset. And frankly, I would say to any entrepreneur that's out there is bootstrap first before you raise money, right? It depends on your goals, of course. If you're trying to build the next Uber, then you're going to need capital and a lot of it. Or I guess OpenAI is probably the more relevant example these days. But otherwise, that bootstrapping mentality honed our skills in a way that I don't think you get from necessarily raising capital. It wasn't about 7 or 8 years in until we actually went through the process of bringing in a minority partner in terms of building the firm. But I'd say those three things: just a fantastic team, great clients that we work with that were just fun to work with, good people, and then just building this thing from scratch is, in retrospect now, I mean, there's a lot of, I don't have to tell you this, Ty, but there's a lot of scrapes and bruises and battles that you got to fight along the way, but coming out on the other side, I mean, I would say that's probably one of the best things about it.
Yes. Well, I love hearing about your solution, and to be honest with you, it's still very much relevant today. It's not like it's something that you built over time and it's not relevant. I think it's even more relevant today. So with that said, why did you recently decide, or why did you decide a year ago to essentially move into this next chapter and exit out?
Yeah, look, it definitely wasn't an easy decision. I mean, it really required a lot of thought and soul searching. I mean, I loved the Smart Cube. I mean, it was I told folks when I left that it's literally been the work of my life, and it really has. And I still feel it to this day. But after 2 decades, and given where the firm was, I just felt the time was right to step away. I needed to take a break. I needed to sort of disconnect and decouple myself from some of that work for a while, and also then explore kind of what's next and kind of what I want to do. I feel I've got a few challenges left in me, so I just felt the timing was right. So I left, what is it, a little over a year ago. I've taken a bunch of time off and just sort of travel a bit and sort of disconnect, and now I'm beginning to think about kind of, okay, where do we go next? So exciting times.
Yeah. Very, very exciting times. And to be honest with you, your book, Risk in Your Supply Chain, I think right now is even more relevant than ever, right? Because there are a lot of challenges that leaders are facing. You've worked with some of the top procurement and supply chain teams. What really separates companies that just collect data and those that are really truly leveraging market intelligence for their decisions?
Well, look, I think I don't think it's process. I don't think it's tools. I don't think it's any of those things. I think what separates the really the best organizations is their leadership has a real. I'm trying to say this without making it sound sort of a broad generalized statement. Their leadership has a sort of management curiosity about them. They are really interested in why things are working the way they're working. They're not coming in saying, hey, I've got a process, I'm just going to execute this process and get it done. But they want to think about it and say, well, what is the data telling me, right? What is the intelligence telling me about what this means and why we're doing it this way and why we should be doing this way? They have a real emphasis on solving problems using facts and data and insight, and they bring that to bear. I mean, those were as you might imagine, as an intelligence and analytics firm, those were the leaders we worked really well with because they were already oriented towards data, right? They were like, okay, I know I need this. I know I need to make sense of it. How do I leverage this to really drive value within my organization? So they had that incoming curiosity. Whereas a lot of the leadership that we saw that were process driven in terms of I'm executing steps, you saw less of that. So I would say that management curiosity is probably the most important thing that I would say. But once you have that, everything builds on it from there.
Agreed. And I think that that's still relevant today, right? We still see a lot of leaders, right, with really big organizations that are very process oriented. They're used to making decisions a certain way that doesn't necessarily include that data and that level of market intelligence. And I think it works to a certain extent, right? Because business is shifting so fast and the market is uncertain. So having that level of data, even being able to be, like you're saying, curious about how to leverage to make better decisions can just give you that extra edge, right?
Yeah, 100%.
With that said, what types of, because people say market intelligence, right? That could be so many different varying factors, but what types of intelligence is really critical for supply chain and procurement leaders today?
Yeah. So I'll give you kind of my conceptual answer in terms of how it's evolved, and then I'll give you some examples of kind of what's part of those, right? If you went back 2 decades to when we started the organization, the emphasis at that time was very much around, I would say the past was around understanding, right? Help me understand my help me build my spend cube and get to the depths of it, right? Help me understand the external supply market. Help me understand who the suppliers are. It sort of help me understand is the foundational question that we got. Over the last 2 decades, for many reasons, one is the type of data that's available. Second is the existence of organizations like ours. Thirdly, the advent of technology and tools to support this. That both analytics and AI, in terms of tools, that has shifted to not just understanding. Of course, understanding is always important; it's foundational. But the emphasis right now is very much on predicting. So we're moving from an era of understanding, which were things like supply market analyses, right? Supplier identification work, building out cost models and helping me understand the economics and fixed and variable costs within my cost base. Things like that, and mapping out value chains, to more predictive work, right? Where we are not only helping them understand what the supply markets look like, but we're actually doing work around what are the trends and developments and emerging movements that are taking place there. We're not only building out cost models, but we're building out inflation models, right? Where we're trying to do more predictive work to say, okay, for this category, not just this commodity, but for this category, which is a bundle of fixed and variable line item cost movements from labor to commodities to a whole bunch of other things. What's happening to the pricing there, and why is it moving in that direction, right? So building out those sorts of predictive models, I think, is where a lot of the thinking has evolved to. So we moved from I'm gonna way overgeneralize, right? But we're moving from a static view of intelligence to help you understand the lay of the land to a dynamic view, which is, okay, I need the lay of the land, but now I need to be able to predict where things are going. So that's the fundamental evolution of what's happened in this space that I think is really fascinating. And now with what's happening with generative AI and a lot of the tools, technology tools, and not just generative AI, but analytical tools that are out there, it's super exciting. It's an incredible time to be in the space.
Agreed. So, to your point of going from looking at a static view, like what has happened, like what is historically happening in the market, to now being predictive and looking forward, do you find that companies are kind of moving from just that process and that static space to just jumping right into just focused on AI? Or do you see that there's a good investment with leaders investing in the market intelligence that they need to really also empower them to make that forward-looking decision, along with leveraging that market intelligence with AI? Or do you think that there's an underinvestment still in this space?
So I think people are recognizing. I'll answer that. Let me answer that in 2 ways. So one is, I think what's happening is organizations and CPOs they still want both. They still want to, obviously they want to understand, they want their people to understand, and they want to be able to predict. And what's happened now is we had relatively fewer tools. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but we had relatively fewer tools to be predictive. And not just tools, but data sets to be able to be predictive. And so more of the time was spent on understanding. Today, I think so I would say primarily understand and then do some predictive work. Today, we're at a point where CPOs want their folks to understand and do the analytical work that provides the underpinnings of that, but it's happening much more quickly, right? You can find that out. We could build 20 years ago, we'd build a supply market analysis that might take a month to get done, right? Some of them might take 2 months to get done, depending on the nature of the category, or longer. Nowadays, it's happening in days, and basic analyses are either available for free. So SmartCube has a platform called Amplify Pro. I'm not there anymore, so I can plug it, I guess. But it has a platform called Amplify Pro that has hundreds and thousands of data and reports available for free that you can just access, right? And we recognize that's an evolution in the marketplace. But they want the understanding, but it happens much more quickly, so they can spend more time doing predictive work. So I think that's sort of part one in terms of maybe you can call it, cycle times, right?
Yes.
Understanding much more quickly, focus your time on the predictive work.
Yes.
The other aspect is, I think there's an evolution in terms of, if you talk about underinvestment, I think there's an understanding that we need to make distinct where and what kinds of intelligence we're investing in, right? So direct versus indirect, and even within direct, there's specific sets of categories, and even within indirect, there's specific sets of categories, and that one size fits all databases don't make sense. They don't do the job, right? So I think the types of intelligence I think people are focused on more. But I think the other aspect that I think leaders have also recognized is I need people, much like me, the curious CPO, I need people who understand and are able to leverage that data, which we didn't always have in the space, right? And in many organizations, we still don't. And so it's a recognition of the time it takes to get the work, the kind of work intelligence that we're looking for, but then also having the people to be able to make use of it, right? So one of the things that we'd hear a lot over the years was, hey, the work that you've done is absolutely fantastic. How do I get my team to utilize this and make it work, right? And the beauty of technology and some of the tools that we built at the Smart Cube, like the smart risk work or the commodity work or the inflation modeling work that we did, was it embedded into workflows. And when you embed into workflows, it gets done, it gets utilized because it's part of what I do every day. So I'd say those are some of the aspects that are evolving and that folks have been thinking about.
Yes. So what would you say are the most pressing supplier related risks that you're seeing right now in the market? I know that you've kind of been away, but there is a lot of things that are happening in the market. What do you think is the most pressing for supplier related risks?
Oh, I mean, I think the elephant in the room, if you will, is our the American tariff policy, right? I mean, I think that fundamentally is driving everybody's mental bandwidth at this point in time, right? So there's no way you can get around that. Everything else sort of pales in insignificance. So I think it's the geopolitical and the economic risk factors that are coming together there. That's leading to a lot of uncertainty across the value chain.
Yes.
In terms of what value chains and supply chains actually look like. And not least of which, because it's fundamentally impacting TCO models, right? So what's your total cost of ownership really look like today?
Yes.
And okay, maybe not today, but what's it going to look like in a month, in 6 months, in a year, 2 years, and then 5 years? Are we going to revert back if there's another administration, or is this the path that we are now on? So I don't think there's any way to get around it. I think it's fundamentally that geopolitical risk issue coming together, colliding with the economic aspects through our trade policy and our tariff policy. I think that's the predominant aspect that I think we're grappling with right now, and I think we will continue to grapple with for the foreseeable future.
Agreed. With that said, are there any specific supplier risk indicators or early warning signs that you think that leaders should be tracking?
Yeah. So I think that they're sort of broader signals, right? So I'd sort of look at it in a couple of parts, right? So one is, I think, obviously, what is tariff policy, but what's the flow through of that tariff policy, right? Once it's actually implemented. I think if I'm going to get my numbers wrong, but I think 3 months ago our average tariff rate was something like 2%, and now it's it's in the double digits, but it's well into the double digits, right? And more so depending on where you're sourcing from.
Exactly.
So I think we have to keep an eye out for the flow through to pricing in terms of how that's coming out, right? So I think that's the number one indicator to see what's happening to actual prices on a day-to-day basis. But I think the second level is to look at your suppliers, right? How are they performing? What's happening to delivery times? What's happening to their performance levels? And I think underneath that, and this becomes tricky when you have private suppliers, not just public suppliers, but you got to look at metrics around the suppliers around, their solvency, their debt levels, their profitability ratios. And I know you get that over a period of time, but those are the kinds of things, particularly if you have small, medium-sized businesses that you're grappling with. I think those are a couple of the areas that you really have to kind of keep a close eye on. And some of this is just broader indicators that you just got to keep an eye out for in terms of just satisfaction levels or performance levels or delivery times or a lot of these aspects. So as and where you see some of these indicators, if you begin to see some level of trending, then I think that's a cause for alarm, and that's an underlying sort of indicator of what's going on. So I would keep an eye out for those sorts of aspects.
Agreed. So one of the biggest themes of the podcast is 10x contract value, right? And how contracts can be a source of value, not just risk, right? And I think that many companies look at contracts as just part of the process, right? Not really acknowledging that many times they have a lot of language built into their contracts that protects them or gives them some more leverage in dealing with these influxes in the environment. We had this one company that we were working with. They had this language built in just as part of their standard, but with the market changing, they never actually ever went back to see what protections that they had in their contract. So I wanted to see from your perspective, what happens when you're able to pair contract intelligence with external market intelligence, such as pricing, the supplier risk, and macroeconomic indicators? Is there some power there?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think there's no question. And on top of that, I think you alluded to this. I don't think companies really think about that, right? They look at there's a quote that you'd hear constantly as you're negotiating a deal, right? Which is, the contract is really only there for when things go wrong, right? And I was thinking about that, particularly in the context of the conversations you and I have had over the last couple of months, and your thinking around contracts and driving value from them, and I think that's only part of the story, right? Contracts in many ways, they need to be living documents. You need to be able to leverage that, and you need to tie it to market intelligence, because market intelligence is what's going to tell you. You can define the framework within the contract. The market intelligence is you're going to integrate that with to tell you, is this moving in the direction that we want it to move to? So if you look at it from that standpoint, contracts become this dynamic tool. Now you have to embed them into your QBRs or your regular process, which we can talk about separately. But they become this framework and tool that allow you to get so much more visibility into not just performance levels, right? The metrics that you agree with up front and the SLAs and terms that you set, but in aspects like inflation protection, right? So where are prices moving to? How are margins being impacted? And how is the performance of this organization changing relative to what's happening in the marketplace? I mean, there's a lot of things that you can, once you integrate that with market intelligence, you can get a lot of indications of risk to your performance and your value chain and your supply chain, but also to the supplier that you're working with, which is more existential in that way, right? In the sense that if that supplier suddenly goes bankrupt, you're in a heap of trouble. And then even beyond that, getting visibility into your TCO and what's happening there through things like currency changes and transport logistics cost aspects. So contracts need to be thought of not just as these static documents that, oh, you know what, when this is for when you screw up or when I screw up, this is what we're going to do. But rather, hey, this is the framework in terms of how you and I are going to work together. This is the basis of course, the terms and the conditions and all of those things and how you get paid and when you get paid and all of those sorts of things. But it's also about how we work together and perform. And here's the framework we're going to lay out. And then we're going to take that and we're going to put it into our process as we work together to make sure we're staying true to what we agreed, and then being flexible where it's reasonable, where it's required to adjust and change for both sides of the equation. So I think it's super exciting. It's funny because it's only after you and I started talking about this that I went back to that idea of, contracts are really for when things go wrong. And I thought, well, actually, that's just not the full picture. It's too oversimplified and frankly symbolic of our sort of contracts as risk framework mentality, if you will. So does that make sense?
No, it definitely makes sense. And I like how you used in the example before in regards to market intelligence, is it being these dynamic assets, this dynamic data that you can start doing predictive modeling. And I think that sometimes because we've looked at contracts as, just as this paperwork locked inside of four corners of a page. We don't think of them as data rich assets, right?
Yeah.
Then if you extract this data rich asset into usable data that you can use in your systems, you can leverage for more insights, it really unlocks a new world. And I think that it also helps you understand, to your point, if you have all of this market intelligence and operational data, then now you can see, okay, maybe even like your SLAs and your KPIs. Well, this is what we're doing. This is what we need. But our contracts actually don't capture that anymore. So having all of this data allows you to evolve your business, not just, just with the insights, but with the contracts as well. So no, I definitely appreciate you sharing that. Do you have any examples in your experience of how having contract intelligence integrated with some market intelligence, how has that bear fruit to organizations?
Yeah, I go back to the example around cost and inflation models, right? I mean, that's a great example where in a contract you can actually flesh out how you're going to look at pricing, what the underlying drivers of that pricing are. So commodity indices and labor industries or energy, whatever else you want to sort of think of it. And you can sort of lay out aspects of how we look at pricing over on a year-to-year basis. Now, you're not going to do this for every category, but for some of the more complex ones, you don't just have a standard, we're going to, do a CPI adjustment, right? 2.4% or 5% or whatever it is. But you make it a little bit more sophisticated to reflect the sophistication of the category that you're grappling with. And so we've seen a lot of success where organizations, we've done the work to build out the models and the parameters of those models, and then translate that into aspects that translate into ideal contract terms that would reflect, right? And then the client can decide how much of this I want to it's important to me or not important to me, and that's fine. Those are business decisions. But you got to start with the data and then make a conscious decision to say these elements are really important, these are not. So you take that framework of that model, the pricing, the cost inflation model, and you bake it in, right? And then you say, this is how we're going to govern over, the life of our agreement that we have together. And then you take that and you bake it into, again, I go back to a QBR, just because you're going to have regular updates and regular check-ins, and that should be part of the discussion process. And it can be less prominent at times when there's really nothing to talk about. But, suddenly COVID happens. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. I'll touch wood there. but something like that happens, or you have a financial crisis, or you have tariffs going crazy, and you have to spend more time talking about it. So that's an example where you can take something and make it very tangible and relevant to something that's important to both parties, which is how much you pay me and how much I pay, how I charge you, and then you make that a more dynamic aspect. And I think contracts can be the foundation and the basis by which we set expectations right up front. So nobody's coming back and saying, hey, I want you to do something unreasonable. So no, this is what we agreed. And here's how we agreed we're going to track it. Now, if that changes over time for some reason, that's okay, right? I mean, again, because contracts should be viewed as living dynamic documents, there should be some reasonableness baked into all of this, right? Because ultimately, if both of us are successful, we're going to keep working together. That's the bottom line of it. So that's an example, I think, from the cost and inflation modeling side that I always found really intriguing and heartening in many ways, because it just shows a way to better work together on the basis of data.
Agreed. Well, I appreciate your alignment on the value of contracts, because I think that is definitely missing on the market today, is just get it from, negotiation to signature. And like you're saying, like once we have it signed, we can store it in case something goes wrong, but really treating it as something living and valuable to the organization. I mean, 80% of our organizations are governed by contracts, but if you don't have that data available to understand what's happening, to your point, to the foundation, there's a lot of money being missed on the table, not
100%.
just the risk aspect, right? So
100%.
and I think that's when you're thinking about tariffs and then the inflation, we can't control those. Like there's, strategies that we can maneuver, but if there's money that we're missing, that's definitely something that we can capture to kind of bridge that or pad that gap.
Yeah.
So
100%.
kind of a shift a little bit from your perspective, what macroeconomic or geopolitical signals should procurement and supply chain leaders really be paying a close attention to in 2025 and going forward?
Oh, it comes back to the same thing. It's
Yeah.
it's our trade policy, right? Where is that going to settle ultimately? And how's that going to play out, right? In terms of the tariff movements, in terms of what numbers we end up settling at, how consistent they're going to be. So I think that's the overarching signal, if you will, that we have to look at. But as part of that, I mean, I think we obviously need to look at inflation rates and where those are coming through, right? Particularly in a couple months. I think it's too early at this point. Or maybe we're getting to that point where in a month or two we'll see that. We got to look at consumer confidence numbers, right? Where's that coming out? But then also, I think we need to look at the rate of supplier solvency and bankruptcies and things like that, right? And particularly when you're dealing with smaller companies, it's one thing when you're a Fortune 100, Fortune 1000 company that deals with large organizations who are able to service you. But the average organization, not just in America, but all over the world, is not that size, right? Yes. They're much smaller, right? And so they're much more susceptible to fine deviations in margins and prices. Yes. And so we got to keep an eye out for those, because that is going to portend something, potentially bigger. So I would say some of those aspects we got to look out to. And the indicators of that will be the communications you get from your suppliers, right? Mm-hmm. What are they saying? And sometimes not just what they're saying, but what they're doing, right? Like we go back to that point we talked earlier about delivery times, and performance levels, and where their metrics coming out, all of those sorts of things. I think we got to really keep an eye on, right? And of course, things like PMI and the PMI index and consumer confidence from the University of Michigan puts that together regularly. So I think you got to keep an eye out for those. But to me, it just starts with the trade policy first and foremost, and then it filters down to all of those aspects underneath that. That's the prime piece to really look out for.
Agreed. And I appreciate you addressing the smaller organizations, because that's many of them, right? I know one company, they are very large in terms of their revenue, but they have like 3 key main suppliers, and if any one of those suppliers kind of falls off, it completely disrupts their entire business. So I think that there's a couple different buckets. Like you mentioned the tariff policy, right? And those changes. And then you have the inflation and then the insolvency. Are there any other indicators or predictors of possible, supply disruption or opportunity that you have seen over time?
I think those are the main ones, right? And really, I tend to pay more attention to the supplier metrics, and of course, individual supplier metrics. But then again, this is where market intelligence comes into value, is what's happening in the space.
Yes.
Right. So if you happen to source from a particular region of China, and your supplier or suppliers happen to sit in and around that region, of course, you look at your specific suppliers themselves, but you got to look at what's happening in the region overall, right? What's the government doing? What's the policy? How's that evolving? You have to look at the goods and freight movements and all the logistical and transportation aspects. So you have to sort of build out your value chain and be able to sort of monitor aspects around that. But I always go back to that supplier piece. I think at the end of the day, that's the indicator, right? How well are they able to manage these macro issues and things that we're grappling with, and how well do they translate or can they fend off or fight off those broader outlooks? So I always go back to the supplier piece of it. I think that's the most important aspect. Agreed.
And having that core relation, that foundational relationship with those suppliers and those partners, so you understand from their perspectives. I think sometimes you can get complacent just focusing on execution of the business rather than being tapped into. It almost is a time to partner, right? Because they could be so valuable to your business. It makes sense to support them through the changes to make sure that you can stay afloat as well.
Well, I think that's actually a really important point, because I think if I talk from a supplier's point of view, I think their concern is, if I this is the classic psychology thing, right? Vulnerability has been like a big topic of conversation in broad circles, right? About life. And if you're not vulnerable, you cannot build a relationship with your partner, right? You have to be vulnerable to them and your kids and et cetera, et cetera. But it applies in business too, right? I mean, the concern is if I'm a supplier and I tell my buyer, particularly if they're a major buyer, that, hey, look, I'm going through some trouble right now, right? The concern is they're going to say, oh, okay, well, I got to look for somebody else now, right? But I think buyers need to provide that comfort and assurance to say, we're partners. We're really partners, not the lip service partners. Yes. And we're going to work together. And look, I do have to look out for my company's best interest, but we chose you for a reason. Let's find a way to work together and work our way through this. We will get there, right? And it's interesting because the companies that did this during the pandemic, came out fantastic on the other side, right? Yeah. And frankly, the companies that did that before the pandemic actually came out really well during the pandemic because suppliers then said, you know what, you're a real partner, you're a customer of choice, yes. And so we're gonna give you the priority on the allocation, which was happening a lot back then. So I think that's a great point. It's a two-way street that we have to think about this from.
Really build from. No, I appreciate that. So to your point of the curious leader, right? So if you were stepping into the role of CPO or Chief Supply Chain Officer today, what would you do in your first 90 days? What would that look like?
So I think there's 4 things that I would keep an eye out for that I want to understand in the first 90 days, right? First and foremost, I need to understand the caliber of my team, right? How, for lack of a better term, how progressive of a team are they, right? How much are they thinking about the category and understanding it versus process execution and just, doing your day to day. So to me, I believe that it almost doesn't matter what tools you have. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. But if you have a great team, you can get done whatever you want to get done, right? So the caliber of team is first and foremost the thing that I would look at. The second thing that I would look at is the quality of the data I have at my disposal, right? And that's primarily internal data first, and then the insight to overlay that to really make sense of that, right? So that's a second problem because, again, if I have a great team and I have insight into what my data is telling me, both internal and external data, I can get things to happen, right? Then the third thing that I would look at is using both of those. What are my levers of influence, right? So what are the categories that are most relevant to me? Where am I most at risk at? Where do I have the most opportunity? Who are the suppliers that are real partners that I have in my network? And how are they showing that they are my partners, right? And of course, how are we showing that we're partners to them? So that's the third piece I'd look at. And then fourth, I would go and look at aspects around technology and process. And I don't mean to minimize that. I just think in the order of things, I think it's team, I think it's data, and then I think it's levers, because you need both of those two things to figure out what the levers are. And then I would look at how we're positioned for the future around process and technology. So that would be my mission first and foremost. I do that, and then we go from there.
Agreed. No, I appreciate you sharing that, and that's very insightful. As we kind of wrap things up, I'm curious, what book or podcast or resource would you recommend outside of risk in your supply chain to anyone leading through uncertainty?
Oh my gosh, there's literally only one book. Actually, there's 2 books, but the first book is just a quote in there that I love, right? So just very quickly, gosh, this is going back 30, 40 years. There's a guy named Harvey McKay based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, who bought an envelope company when he was really young, and he turned it around and made it a profitable entity. But he really became famous writing books, and he wrote books with titles like "Swim with the Sharks Without Being Eaten Alive." His second book was "Beware the Naked Man Who Offers You His Shirt," right? And it's just like bits of wisdom and counsel and sales insight and all that. Fantastic. But in the second book, "Beware the Naked Man," he had a chapter that was just one quote. And that quote is, "You're better off being scared than being bored." And I've remembered that my entire life. That is, in a way, a motto of life that I have. So I think that's really cool, but that's just for that quote. It's a good book. All the stuff is really good, but that's a great quote. But the book that I would recommend to everybody and anybody is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, who's the founder of Nike. I read that book when it came out, I don't know, maybe almost 10 years ago or something like that. And honestly, it gave me comfort because it's actually about from the inception of the company to when it went public, not about any of the successes after that. Mm-hmm. And it talks about the troubles and the difficulties that he went through, the uncertainties. How many times in their existence did Nike almost disappear off the face of this earth, right? And for an entrepreneur, for a founder, for a bootstrap founder, you sit there and you second guess and you question yourself. This is stupid. Why did I do that? How is that? Do I not know what I'm doing? And then you look at these icons like Phil Knight and Steve Jobs and you think, oh, they just sailed. Yeah. But Shoe Dog tells you they didn't. Mm-hmm. And it's literally one of the best books I've ever read. So that is the one book that I tell everybody, entrepreneur or not, read that book because it'll level set your mind in terms of, hey, we're all going through this. We all go through it, and it's okay, right? Yes. Keep persevering. So that's my book recommendation.
Love that. So curious, what is something that you've changed your mind about over the last few years?
Yeah. So the one single thing that I've really fundamentally changed my mind on is I've always believed that if you look at the workforce, and if you think of it as a pyramid, right, you have folks who do transactional work. And these are not judgment terms. I'm just using them generically, right? Process-oriented transactional work. You have folks in the middle, which is a smaller group in the middle of the pyramid, which do, I'll call them decision support work, a little bit of thinking, a little bit of analysis in terms of getting the things work done. And then you have the folks at the top, which are, let's call them the strategic folks, right? The real thinkers. I've always believed all my life that, well, this bottom layer is going to get and has been fundamentally impacted by technology. And with the advent of analytical tools and sort of SaaS workflows, they were going to get impacted even more broadly, right? But I always thought that the top two layers, safe, right? You get a college degree, get into, obviously you want to aspire to go to the very top, but you'll be fine in that middle layer. The advent of Gen AI and AI in general and then generative AI has completely changed my view. And I think that middle layer is that material risk. Yeah. And I tell that to my kids. My kids are 25 and almost 25 and 21. And I tell them, this is a game changer. I mean, I don't think we even know what's happening here in this space at this point. So I used to believe that middle layer was safe. I don't believe that middle layer is safe at all. So I think we all have to get, I know there's a lot of hype, and there is a lot of hype, and there's a lot of stuff that AI does not do yet, right? Yeah. But again, to quote another cliche that everybody will have heard is, this is the worst the AI is going to be ever, right? That we're seeing today. It's pretty darn good in many respects, right? So, so to me, that's fundamentally changed my view. And now we're hearing all about it. I mean, I think 2 days ago, Dario Amodei from Anthropic was on CNN talking about 10 to 20% unemployment in the next several years. That's scary. And that's scary not just because of the fact that people are out of work, which is terrible in and of itself, but it's scary for the follow-through impacts. What happens when you have that unemployment? You have civil issues, right? Unrest. You have major dislocation, which is kind of like the blue to white collar problem that we saw, but now it's happening to the white collar. So it's interesting times. I think it's opportunity. I'm bullish. I'm very bullish about all of this, but we got to solve some of these problems along the way, and not because we did not do this with the blue to white collar transition. We did not put the training and retraining in place and the skill transfer and all those things. We have to think about that right now.
Agreed. No, I appreciate those insights, and to be honest with you, I think we could have a whole nother session on exactly what this looks like, how different people should evolve in the space, and honestly, how we should take this as an opportunity to revamp how we help our kids, or and build our kids for the future, because the landscape is going to be completely different from them once they actually hit the job market as well, or the workforce. So anything new that you're exploring or building in this next new chapter? Are you still in your transition?
So I'm sort of in ideation mode. I'm sort of thinking about what exactly is next. Still early stages, but I will say I think the broad area is in exactly this dislocation that we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. What does the procurement organization of the future look like? And in the advent of AI and generative AI, and no matter whether you believe it's overhyped or it's underhyped, as Eric Schmidt of formerly of Google said, he thinks it's underhyped right now. A little hard to believe, but whatever it is, it's not going to go away. It's only going to get better, right? So wherever you sit on that spectrum is going to change. And what that means is, this is going to be true across the board. I'm only talking about procurement because that's what I do. But I think the procurement org of the future is going to look radically different in the next 5 to 10 years. And I don't think we're ready for it. I don't think the practitioners are ready for it. So I'm just exploring kind of what that looks like and what that ought to look like. And I think for the next foreseeable future, I'm probably going to write about that a little bit and sort of get my thoughts out. And then we'll see if there's something in there that's, I would say when you start a business, you shouldn't do it just to make money. You should do it to solve a real problem. And so let's see what the size of that problem is and how we go about solving it. So that's kind of the next thing that I'll be sort of spending my time thinking about.
Yes, I love that, Omer. Well, I want to thank you so much for your insights today and really spending the time and sharing with leaders on the importance of market intelligence and data and what you're seeing on the market today, because I think it's very valuable as we move forward and as leaders move forward in this environment. So,
well, thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that was an amazing session with Omer, bringing some clarity to complexity and reminding us that in today's volatile environment, risk isn't something to avoid. It's really something to lead with. So as leaders listening, reflect on today's conversation. I'll leave you with this thought to ponder. If your contract data was fully integrated with real-time market intelligence and supplier risk indicators, could tell you where your biggest exposures are before they become disruptions, how would you reshape your next move? Would you source differently, negotiate differently, lead differently? And that's the power of treating contracts not as paperwork, but as a real-time system of insight and action. We ask that you like or subscribe so you don't miss what's next, and share this episode with at least 3 other leaders who are navigating risk and resilience at scale. Now, this podcast is brought to you and supported by Contract IQ, who's disrupting how companies manage, execute, and extract value from their contracts leveraging AI. I'm your host, Taija Dickerson, and this is the 10X Contract Value Podcast, cutting edge insights, where we don't just manage contracts, we master them. See you next time.